Welcome back to the Teams Insider podcast. This week we have James Robinson. James has just broken out to be an independent AV consultant, but previously he worked at BT as head of audio visual and office technology, and he takes us through a massive Microsoft Teams Rooms and Service Hub rollout, how BT dealt with the program, and gives us really good insights into how to approach a Microsoft Teams Rooms project. Many thanks to James for taking the time to do the podcast, and also thanks to Audio Codes, the sponsor of this podcast. Really appreciate their support. On with the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I've been looking forward to this one. James and I have been going back and forth, I think, for a couple of months trying to find a slot. James has a big history in deploying rooms in BT, so we're going to talk all about that, and now he's independent as well. James, welcome to the show. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks for having me, Tom. I'm James Robinson. I am now audiovisual consultant and designer, amongst other things, running AVenture Audio Visual. Finally braved it enough to go out on my own after being in the big corporate world for a long time. So.
Exciting! Congrats on going independent. It's a fun journey.
Yeah, a bit scary perhaps, but yeah, it's I really am enjoying it so far. So
yeah, with your history and your network, I suspect you'll be in demand. So talking of that, can you kind of introduce us to what your role was at BT and some of the kind of the amazing scope of the project?
Absolutely. At BT, I had hundreds of job titles, traditional, large corporate. But essentially, I finished my time there as head of audiovisual, looking at everything that, from a technology point of view, that a colleague would interact with when they went into an office. So that's starting at, the monitors on the desk, visitor management systems, conference rooms, digital signage, all of that sort of stuff. But where it all started, I used to work in IP voice originally, and how I transitioned into sort of this sort of stuff is enterprise voice and Skype for Business, Lync 2013, Skype for Business 2015. So I was brought on board by BT's team of UC guys to focus on voice really, and then it's just evolved from there. I think, and I don't want to be quoted on this, but I think BT had the largest, certainly in the UK and maybe in the EU, but the largest Skype for Business on-premise estate. At least that's what people kept saying. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. Servicing sort of 120,000 users at peak, I think. And, time went on, so Lync became Skype, and, broke my heart a little bit, but Skype obviously became Teams. And we all had to transition from being, nerdy server engineers to sort of being service engineers and looking after a cloud-based service.
It's quite the change, isn't it? Going from like knowing servers really well and roles and Windows and AD and physical infrastructure to working around a giant cloud service.
Yeah, it was quite unnerving, really. But you have to adapt to these things, or you get left behind. And like most large corporates, I think we dabbled in Teams. I certainly had Teams pre-pandemic, but in that old-fashioned islands mode, where I had both, and everyone we'd given Teams to. We may have even gone all quiet by then, but there was a lot of resistance to that change in way of working. And I'm sure you've heard it time and time again, but the pandemic is what forced everyone onto it.
Yep.
Because, so much of our Skype infrastructure wasn't fit for purpose. Lots of people still required VPNs to do their jobs, and our VPNs couldn't handle all that video traffic.
No, it was never designed for that scenario, was it? It was like never anticipated that everybody would be external coming into those data centers, really.
No. I think we had something like 8 to 10,000 users on VPN pre-pandemic, and then overnight we went to something like 60 to 80,000. Obviously in BT, a lot of people were engineers, so they're not really using the tools. A lot of people are call center agents, not necessarily using the tools, or if they are, they're potentially still in the office. But the vast majority of that information worker workforce went home, and we had to throttle people on Skype for Business to like 240p video, and it just wasn't really what people wanted. So, we forced that transition in a very aggressive timeline. Yeah. I think it was about 3 months in the end for 100,000 people, including 30,000 enterprise voice users. So having to go from, on-premise data center audio codes, SBCs, up into virtual ones in the cloud for direct routing and stuff as well. It was a difficult journey, and obviously that had massive implications from a room point of view. Yeah, as well. Before, two things kind of happened simultaneously. In late 2019, BT announced its Better Workplace program, so consolidating 300 offices to 30 offices in the UK, and bringing everyone together, to collaborate and work together. And the pandemic hit as well. So, and before all that, sort of whoever, director of this, director of that, MD of this, if they had some cash, they just went out and they bought some stuff, right? So you'd have, you might have a Polycom CX5100, the round, the newer round table 360 degree one with a built-in speakerphone, in one room, but you might have a Cisco Spider phone in another room, to God knows what. Some offices you had to go to reception and borrow a projector from the security guard, and you'd get on a list, and if you didn't give it back, you'd be in trouble. So we aggressively moved to a centralized technology model where you went, right, IT or digital workplace, you are now in charge of all audiovisual for the entire company. People can't just do what they want. We need a corporate-wide strategy, and we're going to implement it at pace, because we're going to build or refurbish these 30, brand new offices. So we started COVID with maybe 50 Skype rooms, perhaps. So Surface Hub Gen 1.
Yeah, the old original stuff.
Yeah, with the big speakers on the side. And Skype Room System version 2. So the Lenovo ThinkSmart 500 is the first one to market, I think. And a couple of those Logitech docks where you had to image a Surface Pro 4 and stick it inside. And
I think we can all agree in hindsight that was a bit of a pain, like dedicated hardware, there's some value in that.
Yeah, and you don't have to worry that someone's going to steal the tablet either.
Yeah, or the battery's going to pop out after being on charge for a year straight.
Yeah, and we didn't have very much of this stuff. So transitioning that to Teams wasn't a big problem, but we had to sort of overnight define what our conferencing strategy was going to be, and then, roll that out with very limited amounts of community feedback, because people weren't allowed in the office. So
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You don't have the opportunity to set up multiple different offices and test scenarios and all that stuff that typically we would have done in that kind of project.
Yeah, so we couldn't do a proof of concept. We couldn't say, right, these 5 rooms are getting Surface Hub 2, and you're getting Skype room system, as it was, and you're getting this, and then actually saying, well, what do you prefer? We just had to roll with it. And I think that, we made a lot of correct decisions. We made a lot of incorrect decisions in hindsight. I'm going to say that a lot throughout this podcast. I worked for BT for 12 years and I'm struggling with the pronouns. So I'm not there anymore. But
what did that look like in practical terms? Like you've got various OEM options, you've got various room types. Did you write a document? Did you do a PowerPoint? Did you test them all in a lab? What did that look like?
So I had a lab in a ancient telephone exchange where I used to live down in Surrey, and whoever from the OEMs would work with us on testing, got into that lab. So if you were a partner that said, "Oh, no free samples, sorry," then you were pretty much off the list. And we leveraged the strong commercial relationships that we already had as well. Unless they've changed since I left, all MTR in BT were Lenovo. Not only were they, it made sense for many reasons, commercially and support wise, but we were a Lenovo house for laptops. We had 100,000 Lenovo laptops on a 4-year refresh plan. Business wise.
So already a key compute partner, already chosen by wider IT to be the partner in that space, I suppose.
Yeah, and and I think for me, it was more about the tooling that sits behind that necessarily than the vendor. So all of the kit came in to the test lab and we played with it. And there sounds crazy now, but there was a lot less to test back in 2019, 2020. Far fewer options on the market. There were no Yale Links, there were no Max Hubs, Neats, all of that. There were no Android team systems either.
I was going to ask, was there a conscious decision there between Windows and Android? But I guess at that time it was primarily Windows was the choice then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'd probably still make that same choice now, although I think Android is getting very close, depending on what your priorities are. One thing in BT that was an absolute priority down from HR really, who were the sponsors of this refurbishment program, is where we want, as part of our principles, to brand our meeting rooms, and they wanted to do that on the device rather than necessarily. Of course, they painted in color schemes and had furniture swaths that matched, but corporates like to change their logo. I think BT, since I was there, did 3 or 4 logo refreshes and color scheme changes. And if you've got to repaint all your offices, that's a huge expenditure. If you've got to flick a switch and change a background on a Teams room, it's a bit easier. So it's something that sounds so minor, like having your own backgrounds, wasn't available on Android. And I think it's still just a roadmap option today.
Yeah, it should be cut. It's imminent. It's kind of August on the roadmap at the moment, and finally digital signage is coming through. But again, initially for Windows, then for Android. So that's another thing I've heard corps ask for is, we've got these massive screens in the offices. Why can't we use them for digital signage when not in use? Yeah,
and that'll be fantastic. I think that's a really positive step. But essentially, we sat down as a larger community, so not just IT, but HR, IT, various other departments, as we sort of looked at this refurbishment strategy, facilities and property and people like that. And we essentially defined the experiences we wanted people to have. So in the meeting room space, we had what we called a connect room experience. So which is just internal lingo, but that's sat down having a traditional meeting. And then a huddle room experience, which in BT lingo meant actually that's stand-up furniture with high stools and interactive devices, like a Surface Hub, for example. So we had this framework of what do we want people to be able to do in these spaces, and we mix and match the technology appropriately, right, as it was at the time. So
yeah.
The most basic experience we defined was just local presentation. So we actually rolled out a couple of hundred Microsoft display adapters, the little HDMI dongles that just do mirror casting. All you can do is name them, and there is nothing else you can do to the device. And then we had essentially the next level up, as we viewed it at the time, which was MTR, and then like the more premium experience, as we thought, the Surface Hub rooms. So that we're going to be getting up and interacting. Maybe it's a training space, maybe it's a more creative type environment. So the top two spaces would run Teams with various peripherals, and obviously the bottom one wouldn't. And as we rolled these out, the first 3 offices we did, no one moved in for like 9 months. So we fast forward to doing BT's 18 floor HQ in London and a 17 floor in Birmingham. So those 2 offices opened before we really started getting the feedback. And the 2 big learning we had there was the local presentation spaces are great, but we just started adopting. Well, everyone wanted Teams in those spaces, but there was a price point, issue there of getting too many Teams rooms. But the other learning was, BT starting to adopt Mac devices, Apple devices, and there were Miracast only rooms.
Oh, so everyone wanted AirPlay as well.
Yeah. So although completely not required in our call centres or our smaller offices, certainly in London and Birmingham, we were seeing maybe a 5% usage of MacBooks, but that's still quite a lot of colleagues that just couldn't use those spaces. And the other thing was, not a lot of people in BT anyway really jumped on board with the Surface Hub. The whole touchscreen and using the apps, and the whiteboarding was quite popular, but no one was editing Office 365 files. People would Miracast to it. But what most people were doing was just standing up and pushing join meeting and sitting back down again. Yeah. So what you gave yourself was a really expensive room.
That seems, right. Yeah, that seems to be the experience in a lot of places. Hence, Surface Hub is kind of getting less unique now. It's just going to become a giant MTR, because Microsoft looked at the stats and most people just use them as a giant meeting room rather than this vision of having dedicated apps and dedicated experience. It just didn't seem to land at scale. Yeah,
and the mics and speakers, the speakers are fine. The mics were more tuned for the person doing the collaboration on the device than it was picking up the entire room. You put an 85-inch device in a 8-meter meeting room, and it would struggle, quite rightly, to be fair. It's not really a criticism.
No, that's what it was designed for. But people see a big screen, so they assume if I can see the screen from this far back, it should work for me. Like that's how people think, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and don't get me wrong, BT didn't abandon Surface Hub, but it was certainly refocused into, dedicated training type environments, more than it is a traditional meeting room. And the other thing we thought would be really, really popular is, put Surface Hubs everywhere on wheels, and people will just wheel them around the office to do Teams meetings, ad hoc, which, sounded great on around the design table. But it just annoyed people, because if you wheel a Surface Hub around to your bank of 6 desks because you've got a team call, the people on the next bank of 6 desks don't want to listen to it. You want them to be quiet, they want you to be quiet. It just didn't really work, and we were transitioning that to be more sort of, let's put a display out with Miracast and AirPlay, but let's just leave the Teams bit to one side because
so they could use it for like a team huddle rather than a full-on conference.
Yeah, you're in an open plan environment, and even if you invested in expensive sound masking and stuff, it's not really gonna go where we thought it might go. So yeah, lots of learning as that journey went on, and I think we ended up with, it was roughly 1,200 Teams rooms in total. About 700 to 800 of those were at MTR, and then the remainder, so 400 to 500, would have been Surface Hub. Both Gen 1 and Gen 2, there's still to this day Gen 1 Surface Hubs working fine in BT. I mean, they're out of support, but they're not broken. And they're very large investment. I mean, those Gen 1 hubs MSRP'd at like £27,000. So it's not something you want to throw away.
What were the practicalities of rolling out that many? I mean, that's a lot of devices, both from a like logistics point of view, or a deploy point of view, and a management point of view. What did you find there?
For the vast majority of them were done on large scale projects. So, if you open a large office, you're doing 300 or 400 at meeting rooms at a time through the various different options, and that wasn't particularly difficult. You work with a construction contractor who typically appoints an AV integrator. We did all of the design in-house in BT, so that those AV integrators were just doing installation work, and then we were doing our own commissioning as well. So they would throw a Teams room together, and then we would come back and set it all up. One of the key things was remote management. For me, I had a very small team of amazing people, but very small team. And you can't just teleport around the country. I mean, we were operating out of 64 countries, I think, but the vast majority was in the UK. And so one of the key reasons why we chose Lenovo, as well as commercials and the fact that I thought their products were very good, was the Think Smart Manager platform that we purchased at the same time. Now, I know Teams Room Pro is releasing this. Bearing in mind, I'm two to 3 months out of date now. But
very recently we've got remote control on MTRW. Like you have to install a particular browser agent, and it kind of works, but there is still some. The OEMs had it first. Crestron had it. XIO, Lenovo have got a really good remote story as well, and I think they use the vPro technology as well, don't they, to do some of that stuff. So, but there was nothing back then, like from a Microsoft point of view. Intel vPro remote management via Lenovo's portal revolutionized the way my team both deployed and supported these devices. You just had instant KVM access. All the on-site engineer had to do was scan a QR code and throw it in the portal, and you could do most things remotely. So they had a configuration wizard, so you could, without even using the KVM thing, you could send the room credentials and various settings that you wanted to use. The only thing you couldn't do realistic was custom themes. You still had to use KVM for deploying custom themes, and that just meant, if you're deploying a poly camera with it, you could sit there from the comfort of your own home and install poly lens and update the drivers and set the speaker tracking mode you wanted, and or if it's a biamp DSP, log on and do some audio programming or something. That was a lifesaver, because the way we went with our offices in BT was everything was what we called red side internet. There was no exposed corporate LAN to 99% of the devices that were in that office. You couldn't just do an old school remote desktop on VPN. Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they were just on the internet,
They were just on the internet, inbound ports and stuff for relatively strictly controlled. And it's the same. It didn't really matter what tech we were deploying, but that consistency sort of ran through as a theme. So we had one display vendor for the entire time, so we could have one remote management tool for doing firmware updates and seeing if a fan has blown in a screen or whatever. I think the most complicated thing for me was every year I redesigned our standards, because you couldn't sit still and just roll out 2020 standards for 4 years, because your rooms would be ancient. So every year, the MTR changed if it needed to. We moved from all-in-one devices on the desk to modular solutions where your touch panels and your PCs are separate. Bigger and better cameras.
This is the tension of vendor choice, right? Isn't it? Because you quite rightly articulate that if you minimize the number of vendors in play, your operations support, your supply chain all becomes easier. But you don't want to be deploying the same 4-year-old model. You want to rev models within your partner. So even if you stay with the same OEM, the models are probably going to change over the life cycle of it's evergreen, isn't it? But over the life cycle of the project.
Absolutely. I mean, the last project I did with BT, we were on, technically speaking, Lenovo's 4th iteration of MTR. But they all use that same remote management platform, the same support process if you need to report a fault, the same account manager to shout out if something bad happens, right? Which just makes life a little bit more manageable. But what we didn't do that with peripherals, but we kept it so sort of every 12 months, right? This is your small, medium, large, extra large to BT's definitions, not Microsoft's definitions. Yeah. Cookie cutter experiences. So, you might have Poly Studio USB in the good old days, and they still make them in a medium room. But then, we started off with the Logitech Rally camera or Rally Plus system in our larger rooms, but that didn't do the speaker tracking that our users told us that they wanted. So we moved to the Poly E70 camera and different audio peripherals, biamp bars and things. But we wouldn't let people pick and mix, and we were relatively strict with those designs. So, we would do the interrupt testing. So, 2021's MTR was tested with 2021's fleet of cameras and soundbars and stuff, and then we moved on from that in 2022 and 2023 and so forth. So in theory, there was a limited number of combinations. And
the nice thing with the Windows MTR model is they're getting the driver updates through Windows, aren't they? So there's not that much. Did you find you ended up deploying the OEM tooling for things like camera management or microphone management as well, or did you mainly rely on the kind of native update process there?
The only OEM tool we used for that was the Logitech Sync. I don't know if they take from Windows Update today, but certainly even just before I left, we were still manually deploying, or at least manually scheduling firmware updates after they've been tested for those Logitech products. Yeah, I think everything else, with the exception of like the complex DSPs from BYAMP and the like, were Windows Update just crack on. It was an absolute breath of fresh air when we moved over to Teams Room Pro management portal to have control of that and sort of ring everything off, so we could have a development ring and a standard, and then right at the end to have an executive ring. So,
what proportions of units did you have in those rings? I'm interested because that's always a conversation in customers. Is like, how do I split between those rings?
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind, it's only really relevant to MTR, so. We're talking about 700 devices because Surface Hub didn't really do it or need it. So first off, I had the lab. So every test device that, everything that we deployed live, there was a lab version of. Not done nicely, of course. No one's got the space for that, but...
Yeah. I've got a virtual background because I've got various badly cabled MTRs behind me, all in various states of array and testing.
Yeah. I definitely did a lot of cleaning this morning. But, there was a Poly Studio plugged in, a Logi Rally plugged in, a whatever plugged in. So they could take sets of updates first, and we could test them for, I think we had a 2-week window on that lab environment. And then I think we had about 50 devices in the next ring up. So an example of every room combination we had, a couple of each in that sort of guinea pig ring. I can't remember what I called it in the system. And, that's where you would wait for your users to report issues to the help desk. And if everything was fine through there, then the other sort of 600 or so devices would get it. And then lastly would be things like our C-suite executives, so the CEO, CFO. I actually once had sort of a day one fault that completely knocked out a room, and Microsoft pulled the patch. So we only had like 2 rooms out of 700 that took it before Microsoft pulled it. And one of those was our boardroom.
I can guess. Yeah, it's always the way, isn't it? Like, it's always someone important.
So that was our boardroom, and we had to swap that MTR out very quickly. But, to be in that situation where you were using your most important spaces as your guinea pigs by pure accident because you had no control over was not great from a corporate point of view. So, once we were given the opportunity to upgrade early from Teams Room Standard, like most corporates, BT was in a 5-year enterprise agreement. So Microsoft couldn't take away our standard licensing for another 2 years, I think it was. But they were like, I managed to get the business case through to go early because we didn't want to miss out on all the pro-only features.
Makes sense.
And that was one of the key selling points of that business case, is that service stability. We can hopefully stop any of these weird and wonderful things from happening. And if they do happen, it'll be to a lower priority space. At least then, from my point of view, I don't have to get up at 2 a.m. and drive magically somewhere to go and sort it out.
Yeah, literally physically swapping out kit because it's got to be done.
Yeah, that and the analytics that is slowly evolving in Teams Room Pro is what really made us go over there. Because before that, we very limited insights into what people were doing in our rooms, really.
What would you say, like, having all that experience, like now you're out independent helping others, like, what do you take away from that in terms of, because I'm guessing you're going to end up working with some bigger customers as well. What are the big takeaways for MTR kind of project and ops?
I think the key thing I see a lot when talking to people now is they don't really know what they want. So having a proper strategy of what you're trying to achieve before you spend hundreds or millions of pounds is really important. Just exactly like BT, it was a unique situation in that pandemic, but we definitely bought more Surface Hubs than we needed to because of, that lack of learning and experience, which, when you're a bit ahead of the curve, you can't necessarily avoid. But for certainly the MTR market is much more mature now. So having an actual strategy of what you want to achieve and having standards, I think, is really, really important, especially if you're going to be doing your own support. You want to pick a partner and stick with it for a decent period of time and then potentially reevaluate and move on. You don't want to get stuck on the old technology that doesn't support, all the cool new stuff. So you probably want IntelliFrame this and Intelligent Speaker that, and all this cool stuff. And I'm sure there's lots of AI features that will be released. And you don't want to get left behind, but at the same time, you don't want to create needless complexity. I mean, I see a lot of people posting on LinkedIn, and you go, "Oh, we did a project for this client, and this room was a Yale Link this, and this room was a Lenovo that, and this room was Logitech," and you're like, "Why?" I'm not saying any of those vendors is better than the others. And
no, it's about the value of that weird, unique thing they do versus the ongoing operational complexity of that mixing and matching.
Yeah. And I always said you should have a really compelling reason to break out of your standards, right? For example, the new Poly or HP, I don't know what we're calling them now, HP Poly, Poly HP G9, I think it's called, new Windows MTR.
Yep.
I believe they can support 4 touch panels in the room using their Android controller, but with a Windows MTR. And, that is sort of revolutionary and something that I've had customers asking me for years. I've got a 18-meter meeting room with 20 grand of audio in the ceiling, but I still have to walk to the other end of the room to interact with that console. So that could be a very good example of why you might want to jump out of your standards and go, well, actually, yeah, we do use Lenovo, for example, but for this ginormous room,
for this use case, yeah,
it's worth all the hassle and complications of maybe having to write a load of new support procedures and whatnot that is actually worth doing. Whereas if you're just having, there's a Logitech tap in this room, but a Lenovo IP controller in that room, you're like, well, they literally do the same thing. Why would you want to run 2 management platforms? But then some people will turn that around and they'll say, well, actually, James, what if Lenovo or Logitech send out a really bad driver update and you lose every single room, or you lose 100 of your 1,000 rooms in one software update? And if you're more diverse, that potentially wouldn't happen. Quite unlikely, but some people like to err on the side of caution. But
yeah, I feel like you're more likely to operationally trip yourself up, and shoot yourself in the foot versus the vendor actually doing it. And if you're patching through the rings, theoretically you should catch it. But yeah, there's a counter argument to be made there, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think consistency is key for the end user. So they probably won't notice the difference between a Lync MTR panel and a Lenovo one because it's the same UI, which is one of the best things about Microsoft making the software. You only have to learn it once, and then 6 months later you can learn it again when all the buttons move around. But then if you're bringing in, you've got MTR in one room, you've got Surface Hub maybe on the legacy experience, then someone sells you a third-party provider that can, this room can be Zoom or WebEx or Teams, but it has a completely different user interface. I think that is something that should be avoided at all costs, really. BT is a tech company, but the standard tech proficiency of an employee is not.
No, users are still users, right? That's the thing.
Yeah.
People forget this. Even inside of Microsoft and Google and Amazon, the users are users. They're not necessarily hardcore technologists. The salespeople are salespeople. So that definitely applies everywhere.
Yeah, and I think it's really easy for the IT team to go, oh yeah, it's easy, but it's not easy for everyone. So yeah, having, you probably can't get away with having the same experience in every room because, MTR on Windows is probably not fit for purpose everywhere. Surface Hub is definitely not fit for purpose everywhere, although it is MTR on Windows now. But
yeah, your Miracast scenario now would probably be a BYOD team scenario potentially, because Microsoft have kind of semi-embraced that scenario as well.
Yeah, it was. So one of the biggest, not complaints, but the amount of faults that we would have raised, someone in an MTR room going, Miracast isn't working. It doesn't have Miracast, but they've walked out of a Surface Hub room where it does work, and then it doesn't work in an MTR room.
Yeah.
And, so now it's actually better to teach people to cast through the Teams client using the ellipses and going to cast.
The native sharing, yeah.
Which is obviously the same across Mac and Teams, and there is a mobile version of it as well. But even something as minor as that, people get confused. You're not going to be able to have a one size fits all, but just keep it as simple as possible.
Keep as close as you can, or have a good reason to break out of it, and I guess be conscious you're embracing some potential pain when you have different options.
Yeah, absolutely. For some organizations, the right solution might actually be one of these third parties that will integrate with everyone. You get Airtame Hub or one of the Mago devices or whomever, where you can just rock up and send it a Zoom meeting, send it a Teams meeting. The downside you're going to have there is they're never going to be fully feature parity with the native platforms.
Yeah,
but you get a bit more flexibility. So last time I tried to join a Zoom meeting on an MTR room using the native guest join, it was not very good.
No, the direct guest join story hasn't really panned out to be as good as we hoped, and definitely, I don't know if you saw, but now with Teams Rooms Pro and Pexip, you'll be able to do the calendar scraping, click to dial on SIP. So hopefully that'll be a better experience. But you're right, like there's times even in MTR Room where you're going to need to do a Zoom meeting or a WebEx meeting because the customer is on that platform.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'd love to see, it's probably not going to happen, but lots of time the hardware for these things is identical. You can buy a Zoom version of it or a Teams version of it. Why can't you just like swipe your finger and go into the Zoom one? I mean, it would mean an organisation would have to support both, which would be a massive undertaking, perhaps. But I'm an end user as well, and there's lots of things I would love to see. Yeah, that direct guest join was not great. It's not put everyone off. I mean, I was amazed when Cisco announced that they were going to support native Teams Room on Android. If you'd have asked me that 3 years ago, I would have said you were absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I agree. The world has changed quite a lot, and Teams is just so dominant that Cisco wanted to meet their customers where they were in that case. And I think credit to them for kind of meeting in the middle, and Microsoft as well. Yeah, I'm with you. It was a big shock when I first heard that they were working on it.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, James, thanks for sharing that. Like, there's so much to take away from that journey, and congrats to going independent. If anybody wants to find you and get some more of this knowledge and experience, and maybe use you for their projects, where's the best place to find you?
Well, LinkedIn. I'm a prolific LinkedIner, so you can always find me on LinkedIn or the website, which is AVenture-AV.co.uk. It's AVenture without the D, but it is a word in French, so I'm not going completely rogue. So yeah, I'm always on LinkedIn. I've got Open Federation on Teams as well. Or the website has got, contact form and telephone numbers and things like that. So,
awesome, thanks, James. I'm going to come back to you in 6 months or a year's time and see if you're being on the outside and working on multiple projects. See if that changes any of your opinions. But I think everything you've shared today has been so useful in understanding, and the scale of that BT project just amazing.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
No, thanks a lot. Talk soon.